Welcome to Building Resiliency for Health. I am Marilyn Black, Vice President, Senior Technical Advisor for Underwriters Laboratories Chemical Insights Research Institute. Our agenda today will include expanding the definition of resilience, understanding human exposure risk, covering current research and trends, and understanding the expanded role of interior designers today. We have some key learning objectives that will include defining resiliency, both external stressors and internal stressors as it relates to the built environment, describing how exterior conditions can affect the interior conditions of buildings, exploring research-based strategies and case studies to gain knowledge and how to specify resilient, healthy materials, and to utilize resources and tools that incorporate human safety and the interior environment into resilient building practices. So, what does it take? What does it look like in our actual spaces today? Here is a typical office. Take a moment and think about some of the chemicals that you might be exposed to. The carpet might contain PFAS chemicals. The upholstered chairs may contain certain flame retardants to prevent them from burning. The cleaners that you use on an everyday basis may contain a chemical called limonene. The light fixture may emit phthalates when it's hot and operating. The furniture may contain medium density fiberboard and formaldehyde. And if you use a laser printer, it may be producing styrene into the environment. So let's start by expanding the way we think about resilience. In the world of green building and beyond, the latest buzzword is definitely resilience. And I'm sure you've heard it numerous times. And why is everyone talking about it? Well, the effects of climate change in particular intensify, we're seeing more and more weather perils like hurricanes, heat waves, and wildfires. Last year alone, there were 18 separate weather climate disaster events with losses exceeding $1 billion each. And this wasn't an anomaly. 2022 specifically wasn't an anomaly. The U.S. sustained 348 weather and climate disasters since 1980, where overall damages and cost exceeded $1 billion. The total cost of these 348 events in 2022 exceeded $2.5 trillion. Over the past 5 decades, the U.S. has experienced those $348 billion weather-related disasters. This particular chart shows you that the 5 of the worst years have occurred in the past 20 years. 2005, 2012, 2017, 2021, and 2022, indicating that these type of events are coming at us more frequently and resulting in more damage and loss of life than ever. Because of this, the design and construction industry issued a statement on resilience in 2016 that established the definition as the ability to prepare and plan for, absorb, recover from, and more successfully adapt to adverse events. Primarily, this definition applied to the structure of the building itself. But we need to add some additional context to this definition. We need to consider what happens on the inside of the building and those who live, work, and play in them. So let's define resiliency as the ability to prepare and plan for, absorb, recover from, and more successfully adapt to adverse events in a more holistic manner that safeguards human health and well-being from both internal and external stressors. What are some of those external stressors? And you're familiar with most of these. They include things like high winds, storms, fire, extreme heat, snow, floods, water surges, including storm surges. And what are some of those internal stressors? Again, many of which you are probably familiar with. Internal stressors can contribute to the building resiliency and ultimately impact the health of the people in the building. These include things like chemicals, molds, particles in the air, temperature, humidity, biologicals like dust, allergens, viruses that float around in the air. So what happens as a result of extreme weather? Depending on how durable the outside is, the inside can experience a range of impacts. Even with no exterior damage, building materials can behave differently, resulting in poor indoor air quality and more exposure to people inside, especially when sustained power outages take away our ability to condition the indoor space with temperature and humidity and airflow. That's when we start facing more extreme conditions inside. When building structures do fail, it creates waste that can be hazardous to our air and water quality that has to be disposed of, and often requires new materials for repairs and placements, which has an environmental cost, but also provides an opportunity to seek out more resilient type of materials. So let's talk about designing for the new normal, understanding that we have these stressors and they're becoming the norm. We shouldn't just consider that we need to react to billion-dollar disasters, but think about the everyday conditions that we're facing. These daily events are often missing from our resiliency discussion, which includes designing for the new normal. If we're not responding to the big events well, we're certainly leaving individual homeowners to deal with small and consistent events. Over the last century, we've witnessed changes in temperature as most of the United States has experienced warmer temperatures. Elevated air and water temperatures have led to longer growing seasons, earlier springs, prolonged exposure to heat, and increasing ground ozone, molds, and other types of pathogens that are new to us. While in that same century, we're also witnessing changes in precipitation. Some parts of the country are experiencing increases in precipitation in the form of storms and hurricanes, leading to flooding, storm surges, increased water runoff, often causing damage to our infrastructure, while other parts of the country are experiencing decreases in precipitation, leading to droughts, more incidences of wildfires. And these are causing damage to our infrastructure as well. So what does that mean for human health outcomes? These climate impacts all have human health impact, and we're seeing increased incidences of them. And these include heat-related illness and deaths, cardiovascular illnesses, diseases, asthma, allergy-related illness, water-related, food-related infection, drowning and injury, and even stress disorders and anxiety among many people. So the evidence is pretty compelling that these climate and weather-related events are having a tremendous impact on our built environment. So the shift that we're talking about making are to expand our definition of resilience to include the impact on the people inside and the daily exposure scenarios, not just the disasters to which we're reactive. To do this, we need to incorporate these factors holistically in the design process. They're not only the priority, but they're a piece of the important puzzle that's been missing. To understand how to mitigate exposure risk, you first have to understand how they occur. And for a human being, there are 3 different exposure routes. Inhalation, the air that we breathe. Ingestion, what we get into our mouth. And this is especially, and swallow gets into our system. And that's especially a concern for children who have frequent hand-to-mouth activity. And we also have exposure occurring by dermal transfer, which means something that touches your skin can migrate through your skin and get into your biological system. So those 3 routes of exposure are important. In addition to the 3 main exposure routes that we were just talking about, there's another important exposure to consider, and this is what we call settled dust. This is dust that can get into our materials, things like carpet, or it can settle on solid surfaces. And in order to effectively reduce exposure to these chemicals, we need to address airborne and environmental surfaces and make sure that we can clean them properly. Many of you are familiar with settled dust. You can see it flying around in your homes if you have the sunlight coming through, or we have situations where we have disasters like the recent train derailment in East Palestine, Pennsylvania, where we had a smoke cloud of dust that easily infiltrated the buildings around there. So as interior designers, you're not really in charge of maintaining the space, but you need to think about that sort of dust exposure that can occur, the surfaces to which it can absorb into or remain, and how likely that dust is to accumulate. So my message to you is you just need to start thinking about dust in addition to the air we breathe, the water we drink, and the food that we eat. Settled dust is extremely important and will become so more so as we deal with more of our extreme weather events like wildfires. Exposure alone isn't enough to tell us when a pollutant poses a health risk. It depends on two factors: the hazard, how hazardous is that material or those chemicals associated with it, and exposure, meaning how much of the pollutant is present and for how long are you exposed to it. Short-term exposure to a hazard can result in what we call an acute effect. You may get a quick headache, you may get irritation, but long-term exposure can lead to more chronic illness, and that especially is something that we're concerned about. Some materials may be more harmful than others during construction and disposal, for example. Insulation, electrical wiring with flame retardants that are encapsulated in a wall might pose more potential risk to the installer and less to the actual building occupant. We also need to recognize that we have sensitive populations. These people are much more sensitive to exposure to hazards than a normal person. And these will include folks like pregnant women, the elderly, immunocompromised people, those on drug therapies, those that are chronically ill, have pre-existing medical conditions, and children. Children in particular breathe faster, have smaller body mass than adults, so they get higher doses of hazards. So what does exposure really look like in a real life environment? Well, it's fairly complex. And if you look at this snapshot of the air, which came from one of our instruments, you'll see this is called a chromatogram, and each one of those little peaks represents a chemical in the air. And typically, if we measure chemicals in the air in any indoor environment, we will find anywhere from 200 to 1,000 different chemicals in the air at any particular time. This particular picture came from a home showing about 500 different volatile organic chemicals in the air. So it can be very complex. And that's the real world. The real world really is a very complex mixture of pollutants to which we're exposed to every day, 24 hours a day. Continuous exposure to toxic substances that are in that mix cause illness, and materials often are contributing to this. So issues that may be insignificant can have a large impact when the exposure is chronic or continues for a long period of time. And as if that's not enough, looking at individual chemicals in an isolated lab study doesn't really tell us real life exposure. So it gives us an idea of what might be going on. But in an actual room, you will have dozens of different products at one time, all of them outgassing. And these chemicals can react. They can interact sometimes to produce new chemicals that we're even unaware of, or maybe react with sunlight or the environment to create new chemicals. So next, I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the current research that's going on in trends and what we're learning to help you stay current with that sort of information. We have a large laboratory at Chemical Insights outside of Atlanta, Georgia, where we do a lot of environmental and pollutant studies. And one of the studies we're doing right now is conducting research to understand the impact of extreme conditions on materials, building materials, and their emissions in particular. So in a recent weatherization study, we're taking some common building materials found in modern homes and testing them both at ambient, what we may consider a normal ambient condition of 23 degrees C, that's 75 degrees Fahrenheit, or an elevated temperature of 35 degrees C or 95 degrees C, which we're often seeing in some of these extended, prolonged heat waves, or in homes that don't have air conditioning or the ability to condition the air. So we're looking at this, and while we're testing these products, we're looking at two primary indicators of health effects. We're looking at the types of chemicals that are coming off and what sort of toxicity is associated with those sorts of chemicals. Okay. And this slide gives you an indication of some of the products that we're testing, including things like, and you'll see it on this slide, MDF, medium density fiberboard, that's in a lot of furniture, insulation, drywall, flooring of various types, paneling, wall covering, acoustical tile. And in general, with an increase in temperature, we're seeing a fairly significant increase in the total amounts of chemicals coming off. And something like engineered wood flooring, we saw over a 400% increase in the volatile organic chemicals coming off, and almost as many. I think over 350% increase in what we call aldehydes, things like formaldehyde. And that's pretty typically true across most of the products. And then if you look more specifically at them, we look at all those chemicals from a scientific standpoint and try to decide, well, what does this mean? And so this particular slide shows you a list of chemicals that these are ones we didn't see before. When these products were tested at normal conditions, we didn't see them, but at the elevated temperatures, we saw them. And we saw a lot of chemicals that were irritants, things like octanol, dodecane, hexadecane. We saw some renal toxicants like hexanaldecanol and PFAS type chemicals that are halogenated. Okay. And this is a significant concern for us. And actually, going to the next slide, one of the things we saw in some of the vinyl flooring were some chemicals that we had never seen before from vinyl flooring in any tests that we've done over the years. At the elevated temperature, we saw two chemicals, benzophenone, neodecanoic acid. Both of those have pretty significant health concerns. And typically, we would not have seen them at normal conditions, but at the elevated conditions, we do. And one of them is a potential carcinogen and endocrine disruptor, and the other one is a strong pulmonary irritant that can produce chemically induced pneumonitis, as well as a strong skin irritant. Okay. And going to the next slide, looking again at vinyl flooring, we saw almost a 5-fold increase in toluene emissions coming from this vinyl flooring at the elevated temperature. Now, toluene is a reproductive toxicant. It's listed by California Proposition 65. And so even though it was there at much lower levels at room temperature or the normal condition, we saw it much higher at the elevated. And that, if you factor in the fact that in a lot of the new modern homes, we're also have an emphasis on energy conservation. And because of that, we've actually decreased the air exchange that's moving through our homes. So if you put this information in one of our computer models and say, well, this flooring is going into one of the new modern homes, it has less ventilation, we can see that toluene level go up even tenfold higher in the energy efficiency situation. So the extreme weather events are really producing additional chemical hazards. And you've heard me talk about chronic and acute because both of these are very important. Acute is kind of more of the immediate reaction, and chronic is something that results after a long-term exposure and usually has much more significant health consequences. That's something like cancer, cardiovascular disease. And if you look at the slide very carefully, you'll see something called HQ, and that is a hazard quotient. And it's the way we scientists evaluate a chemical and determine if the exposure opportunity is significant. And the one thing that we found, particularly using this particular approach, is that under the regulated guidelines for assessing chemical hazard, that under acute exposure for toluene, we would see little hazard concern at normal temperature. But if you go up to the higher temperature and the higher levels, our quotient goes way up above 1, ending in about 15, indicating an elevated temperature. That exposure to that level for extended period of time would result most likely in a chronic health risk. So extreme temperature is of significant concern. So another area of research that I wanted to focus on were what we call PFAS chemicals. And this is something you probably are hearing about. You see a lot of it in the press today. We're doing a lot of research on this topic, particularly PFAS chemicals associated with textiles and what that means in terms of exposure. Now, PFAS chemicals are perfluoroalkyl or polyfluoroalkyl substances, a group of man-made chemicals across many facets of our lives. There are about 4,000 different PFAS chemicals, so there are many of them. And these are some of the common products that you will find them in, as you are aware of: food packaging, textiles, firefighting foam, your nonstick cookware, paints and solvents, etc. But PFAS chemicals are unique because they give our products unique properties: thermal stability, durability, resistance to degradation, surfactant ability. Gives them the ability to repel water, sweat, grease, and stains. And that's what makes them so useful to be used on all these products. But unfortunately, the fact that they are so durable from a human health standpoint is not really good for us, because they're durable. They're used for the water, oil, dirt repellents that can last for long periods of time. But because they're so durable, these particular chemicals do not break down easily. They have a carbon-fluorine bond that's very strong. So if they get into our bodies, they don't degrade easily. If they get into our ecosystems, our waterways, things like that, they don't degrade, which means they last a long time. And because of that, about 95% of people today have been found to have these PFAS chemicals in their bodies. And that's because they are so prolific overall. Now, exposure data is limited in terms of the amount that people are being exposed to and what it means from a health standpoint. It's an area of research and we're learning. But we have limited data that does show that PFAS exposure is connected to altered fetal development, impaired cognitive ability in young children, negative effects on reproductive health and immune system disorders, and certain cancers like kidney and testicular. So there are indications they are associated with that. So let me tell you a little bit about the research that we're doing. We've teamed up with Emory Rollins School of Public Health to conduct this research. And we're really interested in taking textiles that are commonly used in consumable wearables, things like raincoats, yoga pants, rash guards, and as well as occupational wearables, things like firefighter gear. And also looking at textiles performance textiles in particular, that are used on our indoor-outdoor furnishings, things that may be used in pillows, draperies, and things like that. Since they're also commonly used, we would like to understand if people are getting exposed to the PFAS chemicals when they use these products. So we're studying it, and we have some specific research goals. First of all, measuring these PFAS chemicals at low levels is not very easy. So we're spending a lot of time developing the methodology that allows us to do this accurately, to understand what PFAS chemicals are associated with the product and what their levels are. We want to get that baseline data. And then once we know that the PFAS chemicals are in the products, we want to evaluate how they are released from the textiles under use. Meaning when you wear a textile that has these PFAS chemicals in them, what happens? Do they come off? Do they get in the air that you breathe? Do they migrate through your skin by touching it and get into your system? Do they settle in that building dust that we've been talking about earlier and stay around in your environment for a long time, so that if you get it on your hands or your children get it on their hands, they can ingest it. So we're exploring those parameters on all of those textile materials, and we are we're still in the first phase of this work. We don't have a lot of data, but we do have some preliminary findings from our initial activity, and we're finding that about 50% of the consumer and upholstery materials that we've studied so far do contain these PFAS chemicals. And that's even if some of the manufacturers have said that they have removed these from their products. They're still there. It takes a long time for these things to work their way out of the supply chain. And in some cases, they may be in there from the supply chain that sometimes the manufacturers aren't even aware of. So we are finding them. We're finding chemicals like PFOA, which is one of the common ones. So now we're going to take the next step to understand, using our robotic and our environmental chamber technologies, how people are exposed when they use these products and at what levels. And then once we have that information, we can understand whether ingestion is important, whether dermal transfer is important, whether the settled dust is important. And once we know that, then we can also assess what the health risks might be, because then we can evaluate the amount to which people are actually getting exposed. So there was one recent study, which I thought I would share, and this was done at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health, where they looked at PFAS concentrations in furniture dust in particular, comparing rooms with what they considered healthier materials versus conventional materials. And the healthier materials were products that have been verified through some of the green material programs like Green Guard, Cradle to Cradle, and that type of thing. And they found overall that the concentrations of specific PFAS were greater than 60% lower in the rooms with the healthier materials. So that's pretty interesting, because that does indicate that their presence or whether they're there or not can make an impact on exposure to people. And it also shows that settled dust that I was talking about is an important route of exposure for people. So now let's move on and talk a little bit about some of the industry trends that we're seeing. Very important. Health and wellness remains a top priority for clients today, and that's probably not news for you. But what that means that designers have a great opportunity to offer a menu of health and wellness and well-being enhancements, from the basic biophilic design to wellness dedicated areas within a home or a building. And there are various ways of doing that. So some of the trends that are showing on the importance of workplace well-being have been released. And in a recent poll by the International Well-Being Institute's State of the Workplace Well-Being poll show that almost everyone agrees that healthy work environment is necessary for employee productivity. And according to the findings, most of the American workforce also say health and well-being is a must-have for organizations and something employers should be ethically obligated to support. The Harris poll surveyed over 1,000 full-time employed U.S. adults 25 and older during a 2-week period in January of 2023, providing an important look into the current state of the workforce, including a timely perspective on many trends initiated and magnified by COVID-19. So the physical work environment has a major impact. Employers have an ethical obligation. Supporting health is a must-have. And a healthy environment is necessary for employee productivity. These are 4 very important things to remember. Another thing to remember is that some of the data is showing that exposure in particular to some pollutants, and most of the work to date has been on small particle pollution we call PM 2.5. And recent data has looked at cognitive function of people in relation to indoor concentrations of PM 2.5 as well as CO2. And basically, it has shown that higher PM 2.5 and lower ventilation rates associated with it are often associated with slower response time and reduced accuracy. And this is pretty important because enhanced filtration and higher ventilation rates that exceed what we currently say are our current targets may be essential to protecting public health from this standpoint. So, what are some of the consumer purchasing trends that we're seeing, and how important is it the next time you buy furniture, as they were asked? And if you look at this particular information, you'll see overall that the fact that it's made from a durable, higher quality material is very important, but also that it's made from materials that are safe from substances that can harm me and my family. But in addition to being safe and healthy, folks also want to know that they're paying a fair price for the product and that they're made in facilities that are socially responsible and friendly, that they have third-party certifications of various sorts that show that these products are safe and won't harm, and that they're made from the materials that they indicate they are. So these are some of the trends that are extremely important. And 9 out of 10 said that third-party certifications validating that the furniture was made with safe materials was very important. Now, all of this means that for an interior designer, you really do have an expanded role. Now that we've understand the exposure risk, you understand some of the research data that we're exploring and finding, understand what the consumer trends are, that really presents an opportunity for you as an interior designer. We know that you don't have, in general, full control over the space because you don't really have control over what happens after occupancy. But that doesn't mean your impact is limited. You can specify select materials the best you can as a first crucial step for designing healthy spaces. So today, let's talk about how we can do that and how your role can be expanded across the entire life cycle of a particular space and products that go in it. So let's start with material selection. This is your first step. Being aware when you're specifying materials, being aware of the potential sources of pollutants in a space, being aware of the pollutants associated with that product and how that product might contribute pollution to the space. So understanding it. But in addition to the healthy part, we know that you face many competing priorities when selecting these materials, and it's hard to optimize on every criteria. Is it sustainable? Is it a fair cost? What about the life cycle aspect? What about its function? Is it comfortable? Is it durable? Is it going to last me a long time? You have to look at all of those criteria and prioritize kind of what your particular customer may consider their priority. So, what are the high impact things that you need to think about in terms of selection of the products as an interior designer? First of all, what's the client's top priority? Do they want a healthy product? Do they have sensitive populations and they need that product that's going to provide the minimal exposure to chemicals and pollution? Are they primarily concerned about aesthetics and what it looks like, and it's a space that's going to be only frequently used and not every time? Are there sensitive populations in the space? How long will the product stay in the space? Is it there just for a year or two and out? Do they change frequently? Is it there for 10 plus years? What did you learn about the product itself and what sort of chemicals are used to make it? Is it furniture with MDF, meaning it contains formaldehyde, for example? How likely are those chemicals to off-gas from the product? Is it going to be exposed to any of these extreme conditions? And that may depend on the geographical location that they're going in. If they're going in a hot, humid environment, it might mean that you need to pay more attention to what might outgas at the extreme conditions that we were talking about. And then what sort of healthier alternatives exist for the product if health and chemical exposure, et cetera, is a concern associated with it. So we have the ability in our laboratory to do what we call exposure modeling. So, we have the design set up of what might be a stereotypical single family home, for example. And we can take this home, which is kind of laid out here for you, 4-bedroom, 2-bath residence with a typical 8.5 ceiling height, normal ventilation rate of 0.45 air change per hour. So what happens when we put a product? We can take a product and we can understand the emission rate of a particular chemical from that product. And most manufacturers know that information. Most manufacturers are testing their product for chemical emissions. If they're in a program like GreenGuard or they're testing to California 1350, they will have that particular information. And you can put that material emission rate in this model and understand how much of it's going to outgas into the environment and what type of exposure people in that home might have. And based on that particular stereotypical model, we have loading ratios, meaning we kind of know roughly how much wallboard space there is, how much paint is going to be used, what's the ceiling space, the flooring space, the windows, the doors. So by using this information, and these sorts of products are what we call the highest priority products, meaning they're in there at the greatest loading. And if they're going to outgas chemicals or anything of concern, these sorts of products will contribute the most to the environment. So that technology exists to answer those questions. And most manufacturers, like I say, are testing their products, have emission rates of chemicals associated with their products, and can have their testing facilities put that information in these building models and give you that information. So it's pretty powerful. And I would say if you're choosing products, make sure in today's world that you look at third-party certifications and programs that are testing to California 1350. This includes programs like CHIPS out in California, SCS, GreenGuard, et cetera, do that sort of testing and can tell you that information. But do remember that when you're getting that information, that those tests are based on what we call standard conditions. And that means a standard overall temperature, 50% humidity, and not the extreme conditions where these products may be stressed. So that information is limited very specifically to those standard conditions. And if you want to understand what's going to happen in a stress situation with extreme heat, extreme humidity, you're going to have to get some test data on that. So one thing I wanted to provide you also, a lot of people are asking about the PFAS chemicals right now. They're everywhere. Everyone's concerned about them. The EPA is considering regulation of these chemicals in drinking water. And we know that they're associated with many products. So what sort of substitution do we have for these chemicals right now? They do provide great product finishing attributes for products and their durability and their soil water resistance. But do we have any good substitutes that can replace these PFAS chemicals where we can get that same sort of product attribute? And there's not a good answer for that right now, but I do have this one resource that I wanted to put out there. RISE, which is a research institute in Sweden, and it gives some good information on the textile supply chain, some of the questions that you need to ask on the PFAS chemicals of those that are providing you materials, and also talk about some of the available substitutions out there. And it brings up the topic that's very important, and it's what we call regrettable substitutions. What you don't want is to replace a chemical like this with a chemical that may have unknown health impact on people and the environment. So that particular resource is available. You can get it, or we also have it available. So searching for PFAS alternatives in textiles in particular, there is a POP-free list of alternatives, and some of these other sources, Green Screen certified products, Green Science Policy Institute, all of them have information on PFAS-free products. So you can go there and get that information as well. Now, it is important to understand how they're testing, what their definition of PFAS-free is. It may be below a particular level. It may be tested in a way that it's not catching chemicals at low levels that could still be a health concern. So ask as many questions as you can to make yourself comfortable. So the last thing I wanted to really talk about was a little bit about maintenance, because this becomes very important. You know, everybody has to consider what it takes to keep a space looking good and making sure that those materials are durable and can withstand the test of time. And there's more than just durability. The design has a ripple effect on the maintenance overall. So designers need to think about this, and how easy is it to clean? And what about the accumulation of dust? I talked a lot about settled dust and how dust is important because chemicals can absorb and stick to that dust, and that's a way it can produce a long-term chronic exposure. Very important to consider. So maintenance of materials, are they likely to collect dust? Are they accessible? Can they easily be cleaned to minimize the dust pollution scenario? Okay. Over the past decade, you've also become very familiar with the concept of a life cycle approach to materials. You're probably now considering the cradle to grave or cradle to cradle environmental impact of a product, and what you expect the product manufacturer to own in terms of the life cycle of the product. This also is extremely important. So it's time really to expand the definition to your work as a whole. What does it mean to take a life cycle approach to interior design? It means creating designs that withstand the test of time, which many of you are probably doing already. So it's time you start promoting that. In addition to client testimonials, you'll have lots of customers thrilled with your new spaces. And so consider reaching back out to them maybe 5 to 10 years after the fact, solicit their feedback. This will allow you to highlight the ability of your designs to withstand the test of time, and probably get some feedback as well relative to the health of the material. Did it not only withstand the test of time, but did it create any particular chemical odors? Did it create any concerns for the building occupants, things like upper respiratory irritation or even asthma? You may find that it contributed to a healthy environment. So last but not least, let's talk about overall best practices for maintenance. Maintenance is a good way. Designers have an opportunity to guide clients on these. How do they operate and maintain their home and their building? What are some of the good things they can do to make sure they're maintaining that space, providing a good space for all those materials and products that you specified? So proper and regular operation and maintenance of our heating, air conditioning systems is extremely important, making sure that homeowners, building folks know to have as high an outdoor air exchange rate as possible, bring in as much clean outdoor air, making sure that you have good filtration, that you're using at least a MERV 11 or MERV 13 filter, so that it's cleaning the outdoor air when it's being brought in. Making sure that you have good moisture control. In some cases, if you're in high humidity environments, you may need to have humidifiers. Making sure that you have vents over any sort of combustion source you have, such as a cooktop, such as a fireplace. Open your windows. Encourage them to open their windows when the weather is nice and appropriate. Make sure they're doing that. If you have any sources of moisture that are chronic, you've got a water leak or anything like that, encourage them to clean that up to correct the problem so you don't get excessive moisture or condensation occurring. And even you're buying materials, et cetera, consider the air quality when you're bringing them in. And even if they're certified, they're low emissions, sometimes they may have odors. So you might want to encourage the homeowners, just air them out a little bit. Bring them in, but run your fans, open your windows, et cetera. Give them a few days to off-gas those new chemicals. And keep the area around the building clean. It's important that, you're not bringing in contamination even from the outside. That may be dead vegetation or things like that can cause accumulated dust and debris. So designing healthy spaces has never been more important than now. And we have a great opportunity. You have a great opportunity to design resilient spaces for both the inside and the outside, and making sure that you take a holistic approach to doing this. And when we think about resiliency and a resilient building, think about the fact that we're not only making it resilient from an exterior standpoint to all of those stressors we talked about, but that we also need it to be resilient and protective of the health of the people inside. And with more knowledge about this and understanding more resources, we can all find good resilient solutions. Design seeks to optimize and harmonize these spaces. So with that, I'll leave you with the thought. CIRI does have a learning center. We have a lot of great materials there to help you understand some of this. These are just a few of some of the e-learning courses we have. We have a robust resource library that covers all the areas that we're researching, all the information we have available on materials. And I encourage you to go to our website and find the information you might be interested in. So thank you very much. Well, thank you for joining us today to talk about resiliency of buildings. I hope that you've learned about the external and internal stressors and the things that we can do to create healthy environments for everyone and encourage healthy well-being and making sure that we achieve that. So you can reach me at Chemical Insights. We have a website, chemicalinsights.org, which has all of our materials on it and all information relative to the research that we're conducting, including things like PFAS chemicals. If you have any additional questions, feel free to email me, marilyn.black at ul.org, and more than happy to respond to your particular questions or send you any materials that you heard about today that you'd like to have.